This is like one of our favorite conversations. But we're going to talk about how Health Connect folks move code. So typically, when we're building interfaces in Health Connect, an interface analyst might be working on multiple interfaces at a time that are ready to go into test or production at different times. We mentioned like coordinating with vendors, the 2 a.m. time frame for doing. Sometimes vendors are ready for certain interfaces and not. Sometimes you have to time it with other things that are going live. So really the big thing I want to stress there is there's not always an efficient process to say like all of the interfaces that I've been actively working on all go to production at the same time. So what we have within Health Connect, or how our customers use Health Connect for this purpose, is they essentially create exports of what they want to move from development to test and from test to production. And we'll go through that deployment process. But essentially they grab only what they need to perform that interface, or that make up that interface. They export that file. We'll go into the deployment tool, and then they deploy it. So we'll go through that whole process. So we're in our need states. We only have one interface, so we'll kind of walk through. Maybe I'll actually switch. Do as a demonstration.
Yeah, go to demonstration.
Okay, we'll have a little bit more here. Amazing. So let's just say I want to deploy this HL7 fire service interface, and it goes HL7 fire service message route is kind of the basic one that comes with the production. The first best practice that we enforce, or that we not enforce, but that we encourage customers to do, is when you're exporting an interface, export from the process. Because when you export from the process, it has an understanding of what components it's connected to, right? If I go to this Actions tab and click Export, what you're going to see is it's going to make its best guess of everything that needs to be included in order for that interface to be considered complete, right? So it has our message router with our routing rule, and maybe a data transformation. It has all those components that are connected to it. It's a good best practice for me to review the contents of this, because I might want to add something beyond what's listed. Maybe it forgot that I had a lookup table that I wanted to add. So I might add that lookup table. And now you can see at the top, there's this manual entry, or manually added lookup table. So best practice, start out your process to export an interface. As you can see though, you don't have to export a whole interface. You can export a single data transformation or a routing rule. So if you only changed a transform, you could just promote a transform, for instance. But best practice would be, I would give this information to someone who is going to test this interface or deploy this interface. I'll say like, this needs to go live at 2 a.m. If there are any issues, call John Goodgame immediately. Something like that. And then I'll hit export. Typically, what we see is that this is exported to the browser, which will go directly to the developer's own downloads folder. Server will go on to the Health Connect server. That's not commonly as used because analysts don't have access to this server. So I'll hit OK, get a little export file here. And it is an XML export file. So now let's go to my day in the life namespace, which is my live environment, we'll say. And I'm going to go to management, deployment changes, deploy. This is going to be the interface by which I now take my, or this is going to be the UI, where I take my interface that I deployed and I move it into a production environment. So I'm going to open a deployment. Now, typically, it'll be open local deployment, which will allow you to pick something from your PC. In this case, because I'm installed locally, only open deployment is available. So I'm going to go to C, users, I'm going to go into John's downloads folder. And so when I click this, well, we start by saying there's package notes on the right that says who exported this, when it was exported, and then some notes that says that John needs to be called immediately if there's a problem. Within this view, you could have two sections. items to add or items to modify. Items to add means that these components or that you're deploying into this environment do not exist in this future environment that you're deploying to. So they're going to be net new. Items to modify mean that they're already here and we're going to overwrite them with what we're deploying. So it's a good little sanity check if something is supposed to be there, but it's not. Maybe there's a question of why it's not there. If you are thinking that you're deploying something that's already there, maybe you want to figure out why it might already be there. All right. Right side panel, usually you can leave the default for the target production. That's where it's going to go. And then we'll talk about the rollback in a second. So I'm going to hit deploy. Refresh, and at the top it's going to say finish deploying successfully, right? So if I go back to my production, which only had that one interface before, I now have two interfaces. Beautiful, amazing. But John calls me at 2:05 and he's like, Jess, that was supposed to go next week. You don't listen. I'm like, yeah, I don't. But like, all right, so I should back that out. So if I go to my history, you're going to see an item or a historical item that I deployed this set of this interface. I could look at the details and see kind of everything that I deployed as part of that process and the log that we saw roll out. But then there's this rollback button. And essentially, whenever we do a deployment, there's a rollback file that essentially takes a snapshot of what your interface or what your production, your interfaces look like before the deployment happened. So if I had this oh no moment, John was like, you weren't supposed to do that. It's okay. I can roll it back. So I open that roll, I click that rollback option, and I get brought to a screen that looks very similar to the one I was just on, except what I'm deploying is the rollback or essentially the previous state of my production. And now instead of saying items to add, you see it says items to remove, right? Because we're taking away what we now deployed. I'm going to deploy that. It'll look very similar. And now John can go back to sleep because the interface has now been removed from our live environment. And so that's the general process. Now, the kind of granularity with which you can deploy things, can go all the way down to a code table and all the way up to the entire production, or I should say lookup table, and all the way up to a whole production. So it gives people a lot of flexibility to be able to deploy what they need at any point in time. The other quick note I'll mention is that when we deploy things like routing rules and data transformations, those don't actually affect upstream or downstream connections. So there should be no kind of requirement to either restart those connections, experience a minimal downtime, but still refreshing those connections. So that typically means that you don't have to contact vendors to say that this is happening and coordinate that 2 a.m. kind of situation. So that's a really powerful thing about the way that we deploy code and the way that we run code. But the flexibility is really key to our customers because they might be working on like 10 things at once. One thing might be ready to go tomorrow. One thing needs to go 2 weeks from now, but they're all in the middle of testing. And, there's a lot of coordination and what's the word I'm looking for when you're doing multiple things at once?
Coordination.
No, multitasking. Multitasking when you're building these interfaces.